Welcome back, everyone. A couple of quick notes. Our main stage programming, which I'm about to introduce, is happening simultaneously as our Scale Up Demo Day. So if you want to check out the demo day, head over to the Breakout Sessions tab, and you'll be able to log in there. Now let me introduce myself quickly before I introduce our next guest. My name is Scott Miller. I'm the Managing Director of Endeavor, Colorado. Endeavor launched here in Colorado about 12 months ago. We're one of the newest offices, and we're lucky to have many of Colorado's most successful entrepreneurs, executives, and investors, including Brad Feld, who you're about to hear from, on our board to support the most promising entrepreneurs who are scaling businesses in Colorado. I'll quickly highlight our first two companies to join the global network. CyberGRX is a third-party risk management platform that helps audit your cybersecurity risk of third-party vendors. So you know the risk by partnering with them, and it helps speed up deals when third-party security audits are slowing you down. We also have Sondermind, who is reimagining behavioral health, connecting you directly to mental health professionals who are a good match, have time in their calendars, and actually take your health insurance. I'll step aside, and I'm thrilled to introduce our next panel, the human side of being a founder, with my Endeavor colleague, Alan Taylor, and Endeavor Colorado Senior Advisor, Brad Feld. Brad is Managing Director at Founder Group, a co-founder of Techstars, and an author of numerous books, including most recently, The Community Way. Welcome to both of you. All yours, Alan.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. And Brad, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Delighted to be here, Alan.
We're going to hopefully have some fun over these next 30 minutes and talk about a bunch of different topics connected to sort of the human side of what it means to be a founder, right? Because at the end of the day, founders and entrepreneurs, and talk about these folks like superheroes, we're all human beings, right? So we got a lot of them out there listening. I want to start, Brad, by going back to about 15, which was the year I joined Endeavor, 2006. Happens to be the same year you and David co-founded Techstars. From where you sit today, 15 years later, why are kind of networks and communities like Techstars and like Endeavor important in an entrepreneur's journey?
Well, there was a premise in the 2006 timeframe that I think has been really validated by what's transpired over the last 15 years. If you time travel back to 2006, from a technology entrepreneurship perspective, we were still dealing with fallout from the internet bubble. Venture capital and high growth companies were very out of favor, and there was a lot of skepticism around the impact globally of technology, sort of broadly writ. However, the phenomena that was known as, or now is known as Web 2.0 had started. It was probably 3 or 4 years in. That started around 2004. And in 2007, the iPhone came out, and that was a transformative moment again in this journey. 2008 to 2010 was a global financial crisis. So sort of as there was this resurgence of entrepreneurship, our global economy had this massive dislocation as a result of a 2 to 3 year financial crisis. And there was, during that period of time, very little attention paid to innovation and entrepreneurship. Yet by 2010, 2011, it was starting to be discussed and it's starting to be talked about that the path out of the global financial crisis was innovation and entrepreneurship. So, that's a decade ago. However, even then, 2010, 2011, 2012, if you talk to people about entrepreneurship and innovation, they generally said, if you're serious about it, you need to go to the Bay Area. You need to go to Silicon Valley. And there wasn't really a recognition or realization of the phenomena that was occurring very, very rapidly by 2012, and which I highlighted in a book that I wrote then called Startup Communities, which really was the democratization of entrepreneurship globally. And there are a lot of different forces driving that. I think it's pretty easy in 2020 to declare very, very directly that you no longer have to be in Silicon Valley if you want to build a great company. And I think it's one of the powerful things about Endeavor and the Endeavor Network, and a powerful thing about Techstars, which is this notion of entrepreneurship as a global phenomena, place-based, and geography matters, but this idea that you can build significant and substantial companies anywhere. those networks, just to sort of cycle back to the starting question, those networks are more important than ever, partly because of the distributed nature of entrepreneurship, but also, as we've experienced in the last 6 months, the very high level of efficacy that we can have with distributed work. Yeah. And so those networks then provide another layer of foundational glue between entrepreneurs, between investors, between mentors, and people engaged with each other, whether you're in a physical geography or you're in a network across multiple geographies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we saw that big time, since March, this whole idea of a globally distributed, trust-based network that already exists, right, that entrepreneurs are plugged into. It became just a very integral part of their life all of a sudden, right? When work also becomes more distributed. I want to pick up actually on the book from 2012 and this whole idea of a startup or a scale-up community. Because Brad, I think you've written a lot about this and talked a lot about it. But for the entrepreneurs out there listening, who are based, all across the United States and in Ireland and in different places, what's your advice to them on how to participate in their community, right? Because this idea that, hey, I'm running a company and that's a super important thing and takes up a ton of my time, but also I want to contribute to building a community in this place. What do you say to them?
Well, if you step back from it as an entrepreneur and think about the importance of place for your business, especially when you're not just starting but scaling. Mm-hmm. The notion that the more vibrant the startup community is, the more attracted to certain things people will be, and their attractions can then help your company. For one of the foundational thrusts of a startup community, and I describe this as the Boulder thesis, is that the leaders of the startup community have to be entrepreneurs. And in the absence of having a critical mass of entrepreneurs play leadership roles in the startup community, your startup community won't go anywhere. Now, the interesting thing, and just to relate directly to the question, is entrepreneurs are very busy running their companies. Mm-hmm. And so you have to have both a long-term view of the development of the startup community, and you have to have clarity on what you're getting out of your local startup community that then causes you to want to put energy into it to have it grow and develop. Super easy example that all entrepreneurs that are growing companies need is talent. And the idea that a vibrant startup community attracts talent, and that as companies grow and are successful, there's entrepreneurial recycling, either of that talent or of money and expertise. And if you're a new company or a company that's scaling up, you benefit from all of those things as the talent and the networks and the knowledge in your local community get better. In the new book, The Startup Community Way, Ian, my co-author, and I, Ian Hathaway, talk about the 7 capitals. And the reason we talk about the 7 capitals is that many entrepreneurs get completely focused, and a lot of people working on building entrepreneurial ecosystems and thinking about startup communities get focused on capital as though capital was money. And so you hear in a lot of places in the world, there's not enough capital here. We need to attract more capital. And that's it's nonsensical, because financial capital is only one of those 7 types of capital. And for anyone who's been involved in a company that's now raised a significant amount of money, which my guess is most of the Endeavor entrepreneurs either have direct experience with or other people in your startup community have experience with, the flow of capital into a startup community is not a zero-sum game. It's not that there's a finite amount of capital and it's going to get allocated across the companies that it can be allocated to, but instead, as investors start spending more time in your geography with other companies, that dynamic can be shared with other entrepreneurs, and the more companies that are getting funded, the more capital gets attracted to your community. But if you think about things like intellectual capital or talent capital, you think about things like cultural capital, the different dynamics of what's going on in your community, as an entrepreneur, you have an opportunity to influence and shape those things. Last comment I'd say, and I'll say it with a very simple example. I had an entrepreneur in Boulder, when I started talking about this very broadly, said exactly that statement. I don't have time. I'm too busy running my company. I don't have time to do this startup community nonsense. Like, I just don't have time. And my network's good. Don't worry about it. And by the way, my guess is anybody who said that in their Endeavor interview probably wouldn't get into Endeavor. So I'm in some ways speaking to the converted already. But I said to that entrepreneur, I said, what is the thing you need most right now? What is the thing that you need most? Because our business is growing like crazy. I can't find enough iOS engineers. This was about 2010. We just don't have enough iOS engineers. Can't find them. Crazy trying to find them from all over the place. Okay, well, how about if you run, your contribution to the startup community is, why don't you start an iOS meetup and host an iOS meetup at your office every month? And all you got to do is serve pizza and drinks and get people together. You have how many iOS developers? We got 6. How many do you need? We need 30. If I had 30, I would be great. Well, let's see what happens. Why don't you just start doing it? And let's check back in after a year. And after a year, his company was known as the place for iOS developers. He was recruiting from across the US, so he was able to attract people from outside because of the visibility of what he was doing. And it wasn't because he was running the iOS meetup. It was because all the people who were showing up at the iOS meetup were talking about his company. And he was spending time sort of amplifying his visibility by doing a thing that created a real culture of activity in the startup community. Very simple thing. You don't have to do tons of stuff, but you contribute. And that contribution is powerful.
Mm-hmm. No, I love that. And I think you are speaking to the converted a little bit, I think, right? Because this is what Endeavor is all about when we're talking to entrepreneurs. But I have to say, startup communities and ecosystems also go through tests, right? And go through their own sort of crises, right? We were talking before we came on, 2020 has thrown a lot of stuff at us, right? It's been a heck of a year. For the founders that you talk to a lot and that you're in touch with, maybe you're on their board, maybe you're an investor, maybe you're just a friend, how are they doing September 2020 right now with how this year has been? And how do you see founders you admire and work with kind of building resilience with everything we've gone through this year?
Yeah, so maybe separate companies into 3 categories just to start, because I think the founders have shared things, but they are dependent on which category they're in. Category 1 are companies that are actually benefiting from COVID. So they're companies that, for whatever they're doing, and there's simple examples that you can look at, like Zoom is sort of an extreme example, but there's many companies that are benefiting from COVID because of what they do. Sondermind, which is in Colorado, has tailwinds because their online mental health. And yes, online health and anything that's telemedicine related has tailwinds because telemedicine made 10 years worth of progress in 4 weeks because COVID. The worst place to go in the world if you're sick is the hospital unless you have COVID. And if you're a doctor, you can't go to your office and see patients because everything's locked down. So you figure out how telemedicine works. And the incumbency dynamic of that collapses. So you've got a bunch of companies that benefit. That's category A. Category B is companies that are, I guess there's a 4th company too, I'll put that in a sec. Company B is companies that it's not clear whether they benefit or are harmed by it. Their businesses are doing fine, but there's lots of new stresses. And the stresses have to do with people and hiring and the way your business functions and all kinds of stuff. So you don't have obvious tailwinds, but you're not in a crisis. Category 3 would be companies that are incredibly stressed by the phenomenon of COVID. And here's an example. If you have a company, any entrepreneur on this call has a company where your company depends on people traveling, or your company depends on people going to live events, or your company depends on people going to the office, you've probably had a really, really, really challenging 6 months. You probably had a couple of months in April and May where your business went to 0 or went very close to 0. So those are the 3 categories. There's a 4th category, which are companies that were going to die. And this accelerated their death, right? They were already in, a tough space, and this just made a game over. If you separate those categories, the companies that have tailwinds and that are benefiting from COVID, what I've seen the leaders do really effectively is put a lot of energy into building remote and distributed work as a fundamental part of their culture going forward. So they haven't resisted it, they haven't fought it, they haven't been in denial about when things are going to come back to the office. And they've really put emotional energy into their teams because they have a business that's working. They haven't had to put that emotional energy into stabilizing or dealing with a crisis. Many of those leaders, I would say, are spending more time with their employees than they ever did before, even though it's virtual. So they're putting more energy into being available as a leader. In the middle category, where the companies are not, stressed, but not obvious positive or negatives, those leaders, I think, are more tired. They're more struggling with what do we need to do? How long is this going to be? And there's a little bit of a fantasy of I want to go back to January 2020. And the best ones in that category, by the way, are behaving like the ones in the first category, right? They've said, you know what? I'm not going to try to fantasize about going back to 2020. I'm going to really try to make sure that our organization works well this way, whether we work this way for another 6 months or work this way for another 6 years. And we're going to reconfigure a bunch of the activities of our business to be more effective in this kind of a context. The third category, the companies under real crisis, the very, very first thing that those leaders did was they essentially figured out how to extend their runway meaningfully. And you saw this very, very publicly with some companies like Airbnb that had huge amounts of capital but did very large layoffs. We've had a few in our portfolio that are in that category. And it's been amazingly interesting to watch what happened. Those companies took their trauma up front, they reconfigured their businesses and their fundamental cost structure, 500 down to 250, 1,000 down to 500, 150 down to 75, sort of with a mental model of, there's no way we can manage our business like this, not enough people. Their businesses have come roaring back. Some because of the dynamics around our society shifting to how we deal with travel and pick your thing again in the context of COVID. Some of it being human beings just not being able to tolerate being in little boxes on a screen all day long. And some of it, frankly, being that as leaders, they had smaller teams and tighter teams, and they really focused on the aspects of their businesses that mattered versus all of the things that as they were growing quickly, they got distracted with. And those leaders have now shifted in September. They're very tired, right? So in the hierarchy of leadership, they're the most tired. But they've shifted again to start to play the game that the first category is playing, which is that they're now viewing their smaller but much better cost structure company, in some cases where they're looking and saying, if we continue on the trajectory we're on, we'll probably exit 2021 about where we were going to exit 2021. But we're going to have a much lower cost structure, so we're going to make a lot more money or whatever. And they're shifting into that modality now. All leaders, though, I'd say three things to sort of sum this up. One, I think all leaders that I'm dealing with are tired. And that makes it, including me, and that makes acknowledging as a leader that you're not at your best important. I think the best leaders are acknowledging that to themselves and to their teams, and they're not holding inside the idea that they're not at their best, and they're giving people space for other people on their team to not be at their best. There's a lot more room for apology. There's a lot more room for those moments where you say to somebody, you know what, take a break, you're burnt. We got you covered for a couple of days. There's a lot more how are you feeling versus how are you doing. Where how are you doing generally elicits, a generic answer versus how are you feeling causes people to stop a little bit and maybe be more personal and emotive. So sort of category one is that, no one is at their best. And if you're trying to build and continue to scale a successful company, being really sensitive to that inside and outside your company is key. Second, I think 6 months in, leaders are starting to really look for rhythms. We had rhythms when you had an office and we had travel and we had a certain kind of work pacing and your kids went to school and whatever. There was a January 2020 rhythm that I think most leaders had. And in May, that rhythm was completely thrown out the window. Your kids are doing at-home schooling and you're locked down and you can't travel and we're in September, and sort of the summer was nice because people could get outside and there was a little bit of those shifts, but we're kind of heading in for much of the world into fall and winter. The weather's not going to be as good in much of the world. And we've got a lot of new stresses coming. Certainly in the U.S., we've got the stress of an election and all the dynamics around that. Flu season is coming. COVID is escalating again. K through 12 is not working very well. Those leaders are figuring out new rhythms for themselves and their team to sustain for the longer term, to sustain through the end of 2021. And they're being proactive about those rhythms versus reactive across all of their teammates. The last is, and I think this is a really powerful thing that I'm proud of with many of the leaders that I work with, is they're talking to each other more. This kind of comes back to the why should I be involved in my startup community? It's because you learn the most from your peers. You don't learn the most from some doofus like me that sits on boards and invests in companies and asserts a bunch of stuff and makes endless mistakes. I mean, yeah, maybe, but you really learn from your peers. And it's been pretty awesome to watch we have a good culture within Foundry across that. We describe our CEOs as a mesh network where they don't route through us. They just communicate with each other. Of course, that's the essence of Techstars. I know because of my involvement with Endeavor, that's the essence of Endeavor. The best leaders are putting real energy into that. And they're making sure that they're carving that time out of their work time in the same way they would have with, the travel and the business dinners and the networking events. And instead of deleting all that stuff and then filling in with extra work time, they're working hard to be connected to their peers, especially when things come up that they need to go to somebody with, to explore, and they're not ready to go to their board or their management team or whatever. So those would be the three key things.
I love that last point around taking those blocks of time that used to be travel or commuting or whatever it is, and really blocking in peer conversations, right? Because we've seen that more than ever at Endeavor, of founders reaching out to other founders, talking to each other. One of the topics that comes up a lot is this idea of like, hey, I'm the CEO, I'm managing my own psychology around, everything that's going on. Maybe, Brad, to your categories, folks who are in, category B or C, they are tired, they are fatigued, they're looking for new rhythms, all these things. How do you think about the role of the CEO managing sort of yourself versus the rest of your company, right, and your culture? Because I think a lot of folks feel pressure to put on some kind of a brave, like, don't worry, everything's fine kind of look. But what have you seen be most effective there?
Well, I think this is a function of the cultural norms of the company. And, you have two ends of the spectrum, right? You have a cultural norm at one end, which is the CEO as hero, the CEO as fearless leader, the CEO as I can show no weakness. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have servant leader model. You have CEO as support of everyone. You have CEO as leader, but vulnerable, transparent, authentic, whatever tag words you want to get. And your company norms and you as a CEO are going to fall on that spectrum somewhere. Let's take interestingly, both ends of the spectrum need the same thing, which is that the CEO needs to have lots of time for herself. And if the CEO in the CEO as a hero model doesn't have enough time for herself, she will burn out really, really quickly. And it will be hard to maintain the facade of CEO as a hero against all the pressures. At the other end of the spectrum, the CEO who is emotionally available to their team will become exhausted because it's exhausting to be emotionally available to everybody, especially when that allows them to be emotionally available. So it's not that either is good or bad. I'm not making a judgment on type of CEO, but there's a spectrum. I was just picking either end. And it sort of creates the thing that I think is most important, which is if you're going to be an effective leader, you got to take care of yourself first. And, many CEOs and many leaders don't actually put energy into taking care of themselves. They don't put the energy into learning what they need. They don't try to figure themselves out over time. They emulate some archetype over a long period of time, or they create their own narrative about what their archetype needs to be. I think this is an extraordinary moment in time to go deeper on you and understand yourself as a leader and work on yourself as a leader, whether that's with peers, whether that's with a coach, whether that's with your therapist, whether that's with your spouse, or whether that's just your own self-education and your own self-exploration. And it's not tactical stuff. I mean, there's a lot of easy tactical things, right? In moments of stress, entrepreneurs and many people self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. Not helpful in this kind of a context. And so be aware of that. I'm not saying don't drink. I'm not saying don't do drugs. I'm saying be aware of what you're doing with them. If you have anxiety or depression or any kind, subject to any kind of mental health stress, or if you don't think you do, probably somebody in your family does. And if you don't think somebody in your family does, you're probably just in denial. And if you think of all the stressors that we have in this moment, fighting that, okay, I don't have time to worry about the fact that I'm feeling incredibly anxious right now, versus saying I need to take a little time this week, a strip from each day, and just think about what's going on. Again, you may have the tools to do it, whether they're tactically, making that part of your life in this moment, especially if you haven't historically as a leader, I think is one of the ways to navigate through it. Last comment I'd make on it, which I've been very open and very engaged around mental health and entrepreneurship for a long time. But I think it's a very important moment right now. The amount of inequity globally is probably in our society is probably at an all-time high. And the US is a good example, right? We have extraordinary wealth being created on one end of the spectrum because of public markets and tech companies and successful companies. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have 30 million people unemployed in the United States. And this dynamic of inequities is such that even if you're feeling okay yourself, and even if your company is functioning well, you're still part of a community. And that community could be a geography, it could be a market, it could be whatever. And a year ago in the US, the Business Roundtable shifted from saying that the only goal of a corporation is its shareholders to saying that the goal of the corporation is now its stakeholders. And in a moment of extreme stress and extreme inequity, as a leader, make sure, I shouldn't say make sure, that's too directive. I encourage you to think more broadly, especially as you're trying to create a great lasting company, and how that great lasting company behaves in this moment where there is such extraordinary stress on so many people that are around us every day. And when you think about that, that also to some degree helps you as a leader recalibrate. Because if all you're doing is thinking about your business and you're not able to open the aperture wider, and then all the stimuli you get for everything else is whatever the contemporary news is, and whatever those inputs are, whatever you read on Facebook and Twitter, that's super unhealthy in this moment. So the sort of individual time, space for reflection, communication with people you're close to that you trust, and your own exploration, I think will make you over a long period of time a much better leader.
I really appreciate that. I think it's a really important message for entrepreneurs to hear. It's an important message for all of us to hear. I think as human beings, we find at Endeavor, one thing we recognize is founders tend to spend so much time and energy and effort building their company, scaling their company, thinking about their company, and actually, if they could do two things, right? One, widen out to think about their community, but two, also zoom in to think about themselves personally. Both of those are super helpful in actually scaling yourself, caring for yourself, managing yourself as a leader for the long term.
Well, and just to underscore that and echo one thing, it creates some perspective that when your head is always in your business, you lose about how you and your business can interact with other things. And it's easy to dismiss that. I dismissed that in my first company. For the first 7 years of running my company, I'm working 100 hours a week. The only thing that matters is my company. And there was a moment in time where that didn't work for me as a human anymore. And in that moment of time where some stressors came on top of me, that was very, very difficult because I hadn't built, you used the word resilience earlier. I hadn't built the resilience to be able to deal with the stressors that were exogenous to me in the moment.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating exercise. You know, no matter how successful any of us get, you only get 168 hours in a week, right? You got to sleep some of them. So if you kind of put those up on a whiteboard and say, how many hours am I working on the company versus myself, versus my community, my family, these other things, it's a very interesting time audit, I think, for founders to do. Okay, great. So Brad, in the last 5 minutes, a couple things to touch quickly, but you did bring up briefly sort of mental health, and I think you've been a great advocate and voice for this since being more public about your own story back in 2013. Can you just comment briefly for everybody listening why this is so important, why we have to get rid of the stigma, why especially within the founder community it's important that people feel safe and able to talk about this and get help they need?
Yeah, so fortunately, the stigma in some parts of the world around mental health, especially in entrepreneurship and leadership, is lessening, but there's still meaningful stigma. So it's, in 7 years since 2013, when I started putting energy into this, the positive news is it has lessened some. When I was running my first company in the 1990s and I had an extended depressive episode, I was very functional in my business while I was depressed, but I had a very joyless life while I was depressed. Not only was there immense stigma, I had incredible shame about every aspect of it. I had shame that, I was depressed. Had shame that I saw a therapist. Had shame that I took medication. And there is a very powerful negative feedback loop when you're struggling with something and you're unable to, with people that you're close to, the people that you're involved with, be open and extend yourself to them. And especially in the context of work and leadership. Part of my motivation for eliminating the stigma associated with mental health, especially in entrepreneurship, was that in 2012 in the US, several well-known high-profile entrepreneurs committed suicide. And it was out of the blue, like nobody actually could process it. And what happened was, as I was one of the few people that started to be open with my own struggles with anxiety and depression, hundreds of well-known entrepreneurs reached out, many who I didn't know, many whose names everybody on this call would recognize. And in a lot of cases, I was the first person, they would say I was the first person they were talking to. And so for me, I already knew that it was an endemic problem, but I didn't understand the weight of the stigma. I'll shift it very quickly to something that I encourage everybody to watch to get a feeling for this, especially if you're shaking your head no, or you're sort of like, don't want to think about that, don't want to engage with that. There's a new documentary on HBO called The Weight of Gold. And Michael Phelps, the American swimmer, is the navigator or the narrator. I'm one of the funders of that movie. Dave Morin, who was early at Facebook, has been very open with his struggles and is now running a company that's all around mental health, is one of the supporters. And a number of great people are in the film, including Jeremy Bloom, who's a super successful entrepreneur, runs a company called Integrate, but was also a multi-year ski champion, went to the Olympics twice. And it's a 1 hour long film that walks you through the incredible depression and the incredible stigma that Olympic athletes have and face. Apollo Ono, the speed skater, is another one. So think about having a film like that with the same level of caliber of entrepreneurs talking about their struggles and what they've learned and how they navigate it. I think it's really powerful that we're now in a zone where some percentage of our population in leadership is starting to acknowledge the struggles and recognize that if it's not you, if you don't have the struggles, it's probably someone close to you. And that it's very, very difficult to ignore the stresses, and that mental health is a challenge, just like diabetes, just like cancer, just like a whole bunch of other things. And there was a point in time in our society where cancer was a stigma. And if you had cancer, it was a death sentence. And if somebody had cancer, you're kind of afraid. I'm in my mid-50s. I remember very much the same thing with HIV and AIDS in the 1980s. And if you think about where many of the disease states that we have as a society are today, that stigma has lessened dramatically. And as a result, people are much more high functioning in those moments. And yet we still have this mental health stigma that's extreme, especially among leadership. So I think eliminating it is very powerful, because not only will it help people be better leaders and better entrepreneurs, I think it'll make for a much healthier society.
1 minute left. That's the voice of God telling us there. Well, Brad, I guess with 1 minute, we got a good question from the audience. That you've recently written a book. You recommended a good film there to check out. But the question is, for folks who are listening and watching today, who are interested in this particular topic, right? Kind of the human part of being a founder, or let's say being a founder and a human being at the same time. Is there anything out there, a book, a blog, a podcast that you think is interesting for them to check out to kind of go deeper on this topic?
Yeah, I'll recommend 2 books. And then I'll end with a third book that's a powerful book to just read. The 2 books are a book by Jerry Colonna, and that book is Reboot, The Art of Leadership and Growing Up. Spectacular book. Jerry is one of my closest friends. He's probably, I think, the best CEO coach in the world, and he was an extraordinarily successful VC with Fred Wilson in the 1990s at Flatiron Partners. So that book hits right at this. My wife, Amy Batchelor, and I also wrote a book called Startup Life, Surviving and Thriving in a Relationship with an Entrepreneur. I'd recommend that book also. Both books have elements of memoir in them, but they're not memoirs. And I think the best books like this are ones that have elements of memoirs, but lots of storytelling from others, lots of journey through different topics, rather than a checklist of here's the 9 things you need to do, Mm-hmm. So I would put both of those books out there. I understand that one of them is self-referential, but I feel like that's useful. And then a book that I would encourage people to read, and I lost the author's name, unfortunately, it's not in my head, is The End of October. And in fact, I'll look it up while we're typing. End of October. Lawrence Wright. It's fiction. It came out in April, which meant he had it finished in January or February. He's a wonderful writer. It's not his first book. And it's a story of a global pandemic. And it's a very dystopian version of what we're going through. And I would say even in September, if you used his book and did a timeline, we're probably about 25% of the way through the book. So It has a very dystopian ending. So I sure hope as a society we don't go that direction. But it's incredibly perspective building. I read it early in the pandemic, and I went back and skimmed it recently, and it's unbelievably prescient about the unintended consequences that happen in the context of this. And it foreshadows some things that could go very, very wrong in the next 6 to 12 months if we as a species don't continue to be disciplined and focused about what we need to do, and or if government in different parts of the world or globally behaves irrationally or irresponsibly in the context of it. So that would be if you like contemporary fiction that smacks you in the forehead, The End of October is that book.
I'm pretty sure based on that endorsement, even if you don't, we're going to go get it and read it right now. All right. Well, Brad, thank you so much for doing this. We're grateful. It was a lot of fun. And till next time.
Till next time, Endeavor folks, thank you for letting me be part of your world.